Delighted to call this hearing of the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control to order. We have some terrific witnesses with us today, 3 of 4 of whom are present, but the other promises he's 2 minutes out, and since he's not a senator, I might believe him. When senators say that they're 2 minutes out, you know it's more like 20. In fact, I think the record was set by Ted Kennedy when he was called by the cloakroom and told he needed to get to a vote. He said, "I'm at the airport." What he didn't tell them was the Boston airport. Never believe a senator about when he's showing up is the motto. So thank you all for being here. Illicit narcotics, as we know, often come into the United States from other places by way of complex supply chains, cocaine from South America or heroin from Afghanistan and Asia's Golden Triangle. Today's scourge, fentanyl, usually begins in Chinese chemical factories before passing through Mexico on the way to the United States. Fentanyl and other synthetic opioids can be made just about anywhere by just about anyone, with only a few chemical ingredients, making interdiction and enforcement efforts difficult. A single kilogram of fentanyl can produce more than 1 million counterfeit pill dosages and generate millions of dollars in revenue. So an intercepted package or seized supply is just a cost of doing business for cartels. A lot of people are dying from fentanyl overdose. 436 died of drug overdose in Rhode Island in 2022 alone. So we need to supplement interdiction efforts against fentanyl with solutions to dismantle the way cartels operate. For every gram of fentanyl sold into America, there's a chemical supply chain. For every dollar of illicit fentanyl sold in America, there's a dollar in revenue to get back to the cartels. By attacking the supply chain and the money flow, we can supplement interdiction efforts. In particular, we must ensure that dirty money cannot be hidden in our country on its way back into the pockets of cartels, terrorists, and other transnational criminals. That is why the Corporate Transparency Act that Senator Grassley and I passed into law to shed some light into shell corporations was so important. The revenue side, like the supply chain, is an international business. Chinese money laundering organizations have gotten very good at shielding ill-gotten gains. These organizations launder cartel cash quicker and cheaper than competitors, often with a money-back guarantee. Treasury's 2024 National Money Laundering Risk Assessment identifies Chinese money laundering organizations as some of the worst money laundering actors. Quote, enabling Mexican cartels to seamlessly exchange U.S. dollars derived from the sale of narcotics for Mexican pesos. Chinese money laundering organizations enrich drug trafficking organizations and, in turn, finance the production of fentanyl. It's a cycle that we need to disrupt. The U.S. and our international partners have been slow to adapt to this threat. Globally, less than 1% of illicit financial flows are confiscated each year, according to the United Nations. At our last hearing, a retired DEA agent told us that less resources are dedicated to money laundering investigations today than 20 years ago. We can and must turn that trend around. I've introduced a bipartisan bill to establish a cross-border financial crime center within Homeland Security to coordinate federal financial crimes investigations and information related to the U.S. border. This center would bolster the United States' ability to take on CMLO, Chinese Money Laundering Organization, networks, and should be included in this year's defense package. Treasury, under our Corporate Transparency Act, has established a beneficial ownership registry, which will help law enforcement identify who's behind anonymous shell corporations used in criminal schemes. Treasury is also addressing money laundering vulnerabilities in the investment and residential real estate sectors, and I hope we'll soon cover the commercial real estate sector as well. Unfortunately, there are licensed white-collar professionals in America's legal, accounting, and investment industries who enable transnational criminals. My Enablers Act would place common-sense guardrails on American professionals to ensure that cartels, terrorists, and kleptocrats cannot find refuge in our legitimate economy. Treasury, DOJ, and other federal agencies on the front lines also need resources against financial crime and cartels, which is why I'm co-leading the annual FinCEN appropriations letter with co-chair Grassley. I welcome budding signs of cooperation from Mexico and China. Treasury Secretary Yellen just announced a new U.S.-China working group on illicit finance. Co-chair Grassley and I sent a letter about this to the Chinese, and we didn't get much of a response, so this is an improvement. I encourage this initiative, and I hope for concrete outcomes. But let me be clear, the urgency of the fentanyl crisis demands that we not solely depend on the goodwill of other countries. We can and must take steps here at home to make our financial sector more transparent, hold money launderers and complicit professionals to account, and run enforcement efforts hard against the revenue and supply chain side of the cartel's deadly business. And with that, I recognize my distinguished co-chair, Senator Grassley.
Thank you very much, Senator Whitehouse, for holding this very important hearing, and thanks for our witnesses for being here, and more importantly, whatever time you had to put in to prepare for this. We appreciate it. This hearing not only presents an opportunity to discuss what we should enact, but also legislation we should not enact as we want to handle and get a very big handle on Chinese money laundering organizations. I want to highlight a troubling example that should caution Congress to consider carefully legislative proposals easing money laundering laws. On Sunday evening in late November 2022, Chen Wu charged into a garage located on a fraudulently registered medical marijuana farm in Kingfisher County, Oklahoma. Inside, 4 workers were packaging marijuana, supervised by their boss. Like Wu, they were all from China. Wu waved a 9mm pistol as he entered the garage and demanded back pay. He fired a warning shot into his boss's knee and told the group they had half an hour to pay him. If they didn't, he'd kill them all. And that's exactly what Wu did. The following video of 1 minute length shows Kingfisher County sheriffs responding to the scene.
Who else, my friend? Hurry, hurry. Who? Are there other people inside?
Yeah.
Okay. Mike! Sheriff's Department! Body. Multiple bodies. We don't know where shooter is. We've got 4 dead bodies in there. Right side clear. That was that locked door.
Well, I want to thank Kingfisher County Sheriff's Office for responding to a dangerous situation and law enforcement in general for doing the work. According to Oklahoma law enforcement, 2,000 of the 3,000 licensed marijuana farms flagged for suspicious activity over the last year had a Chinese connection providing funding, labor, or both. This illegal industry has grown up around China's capital flight laws, which cap the amount of money, currency specifically, that Chinese nationals are allowed to transfer abroad each year. This is the same driver behind Chinese money laundering organizations. There's been a lot of debate about whether state-sanctioned marijuana businesses should be able to access the U.S. banking system. The proposal on the table assumes that state and local regulations will hold back organized crime. The Kingfisher County murders show us that that assumption is just plain wrong. If this legislation passes, Chinese money laundering organizations will have an additional avenue for cleaning dirty money. They can simply hand it off to Chinese criminal organizations fraudulently running state-sanctioned marijuana farms for introduction into the U.S. banking system. According to the Treasury Department, Chinese money organizations are, quote, becoming one of the most significant money laundering threat actors facing the U.S. financial system, end quote. Now is the time to make it harder for criminals to move dirty money and buy assets in the United States, not making it easier. This complex money laundering problem requires well thought out solutions, and I look forward to discussing those solutions this very day with this very panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know I speak for Senator Grassley and all of our colleagues on the caucus watching this distinguished panel of law enforcement officers to offer my condolences on the death of the Deputy U.S. Marshal and the 3 other members of the warrant task force who were murdered. And our hearts obviously go out to their families who are deeply grieving, and also to those officers who were wounded. We all wish them a very speedy recovery. It's a reminder today of the kind of risk that those of you in law enforcement put yourself through, and I know Senator Grassley joins me in that. Our first witness will be Kemp Chester, the Senior Advisor to the Director of National Drug Control Policy. In this role, he advises on shaping policy designed to reduce the availability of all illicit or illegally trafficked drugs and their precursor chemicals into the United States by disrupting their global supply chains. Mr. Chester also leads the United States counter-narcotics relationships with China and India. He previously served as a U.S. Army officer for 27 years in command and staff positions around the world. Brian Nelson is the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. In this role, he leads several offices, including the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Prior to joining Treasury, Mr. Nelson was the Chief Legal Officer at the Organizing Committee for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. His previous government service includes roles as a Senior Policy Advisor, Policy Chief, and General Counsel in the California Department of Justice, where he oversaw key national security initiatives. Ricardo Mayoral is the Acting Assistant Director of the Countering Transnational Organized Crime Division for Homeland Security Investigations, where he oversees HSI's targeting of criminal organizations involved in traditional and trade-based money laundering, drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other crimes. In previous leadership roles at HSI, Mr. Mayoral oversaw international operations, including the Transnational Criminal Investigative Unit program, and directed HSI's global trade and counterproliferation investigations. William Kimbell is the Drug Enforcement Administration's Chief of Operations and Assistant Administrator for the Operations Division, where he commands DEA's global drug enforcement offices across 241 domestic offices and 93 foreign offices in 69 countries, as well as DEA's Special Operations Division. Mr. Kimbell previously served as the DEA's Deputy Chief of Domestic Operations. He was one of the first assistant special agents in charge for DEA's counter-threat teams, and he served as a law enforcement professional for over 29 years. We welcome all you gentlemen here. If you don't mind making your remarks in the order of your introduction, starting with Mr. Chester, and if you could confine yourself to 5 minutes, your entire statement will be made a matter of the committee's record, the caucus's record. Please proceed. Oh, yeah, please proceed, Mr. Chester.
Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, and members of the caucus, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Not long ago, illicit drug production was largely limited to processing poppy, harvesting coca, or manipulating crude chemicals to make methamphetamine. The finished drugs were moved through a hierarchical drug cartel to street-level retailers and eventually sold in face-to-face cash transactions on a street corner somewhere in America. While this structure still exists, today it has been joined by a global business enterprise that manufactures and markets potent and deadly synthetic drugs and operates as a free rider on the back of the legitimate 21st century global economy that moves materials, products, ideas, and money across borders with incredible speed. The global business of illicit drug production and trafficking moves quickly, and it moves in one direction, toward expanded markets and increased profits. Today's drug producers and traffickers are in the constant pursuit of lower production costs, the widest possible customer base, the reduced risk of detection and interdiction, and maximum profits. Synthetic drugs check all those boxes. They can be produced with minimal upfront cost, pressed into counterfeit pills for witting and unwitting customers alike, and moved in much smaller and hard-to-detect amounts to be sold for outsized profit. One of the defining features of this globalized drug trade is its financial backbone, which presents constantly evolving challenges as drug traffickers circumvent banking regulations and anti-money laundering laws to hide their profits. But while the desire for wealth is what drives the business of drug trafficking, it is the need for operating capital that sustains it. Operating on this global scale requires the acquisition of raw materials such as precursor chemicals or pill-packing machinery, the manufacture of the drugs themselves, the marketing, sale, and purchase of the finished products, and delivery to the purchaser. This demands a steady infusion of operating capital throughout the production and supply chain, involving the movement of funds across borders with speed and efficiency. More than a year ago, the administration announced its strengthened approach to crack down on illicit fentanyl supply chains. This strategic approach, which we call commercial disruption, targets key vulnerabilities in this illicit drug enterprise to disrupt its ability to operate and make the business of drug production and trafficking more costly, more time-consuming, more difficult, and ultimately less profitable. This global enterprise employs thousands of brokers, facilitators, and financiers. And President Biden's 2021 executive order on imposing sanctions on foreign persons involved in the global illicit drug trade was a generational leap forward in our capability to go after the financial enablers of the drug trade and not just its kingpins. The vast majority of the physical and virtual terrain on which drug traffickers operate to purchase their raw materials and sell their drugs involves private sector entities whose legitimate businesses are being exploited, and many of them have no idea they're a constituent part of an illicit business enterprise. Internationally, a foundational element of our effort to disrupt the synthetic drug supply chain is close and mutually beneficial bilateral relationships with key partner countries who play a vital role in our efforts to halt the production and trafficking of these drugs and hold accountable those who operate this global illicit business. Criminals based in the People's Republic of China have emerged as the professional money launderers of choice for Mexican drug traffickers seeking to move their funds around the world. Our counter-narcotics relationships with Mexico, the PRC, and others are instrumental in making tangible and sustainable progress toward fully addressing synthetic drug production and trafficking and disrupting the illicit financial architecture that supports it. But this is a global problem, and global problems require global solutions. And as important as our bilateral relationships are, American leadership, through the United Nations, through the Global Coalition to Address Synthetic Drug Threats in other forums, is essential in galvanizing international efforts to confront this global challenge. This caucus was established 4 years before ONDCP, and together we have kept the drug issue at the forefront of our national consciousness for the past 35 years, and together we will change the trajectory of the complex and dynamic challenge we face today. On behalf of Dr. Gupta, I want to thank this caucus and your congressional colleagues, and we look forward to continuing our work with you to end this epidemic and save American lives. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nelson. Undersecretary Nelson, good to have you with us. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chester. Undersecretary Nelson, good to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Chairman Whitehouse, Chairman Grassley, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak today about countering Chinese money laundering organizations. This is a timely hearing as I just returned from Puerto Rico, where I spoke with federal law enforcement authorities and local officials on how Treasury can enhance our support to their efforts to stem the flow of narcotics into the mainland United States. I look forward to speaking with you about the risks, our authorities, and how we are working across the interagency and internationally to combat these threats. Drug traffickers and bad actors, as we know, are motivated by profit. We have assessed that by charging lower fees, providing guarantees on losses, as Chairman Whitehouse said, and simplifying the money laundering process. CMLOs have become one of the most significant money laundering threats to the U.S. financial system, as Chairman Grassley rightly noted. My team is actively implementing a counter-fentanyl strategy to synchronize and maximize the application and impact of Treasury's wide-ranging authorities to disrupt fentanyl trafficking networks, to include CMLOs. We are bringing to bear our unique analytic capabilities, the disruptive impact of our sanctions and other enforcement actions, international partnerships, and systemic regulatory reforms to holistically target the illicit financial supply chain, facilitating fentanyl trafficking to cut these bad actors off from the U.S. financial system. I am pleased to be here alongside my interagency colleagues with whom we work very closely. One of Treasury's top priorities is supporting our law enforcement partners' counter-narcotics efforts. For example, in October of 2023, Treasury designated 28 entities and individuals to amplify the financial impact of DOJ's 8 indictments charging China-based companies for crimes related to illicit narcotics trafficking. FinCEN and OFAC are also active participants in a number of law enforcement task forces combating narcotics traffickers and the network supporting their ability to raise and move funds. To further support law enforcement efforts, FinCEN regularly prepares analytical reports derived from an analysis of tens of thousands of suspicious activity reports and other data. Recent confidential FinCEN analysis has identified CMLO typologies in granular detail to provide useful lead information to law enforcement. Severing illicit precursor supply chains also, of course, requires strong coordination with foreign counterparts. This is why we have directly engaged with the PRC on counter-narcotics efforts, such as via the U.S. PRC Counter-Narcotics Working Group. We are leveraging this mechanism to engage PRC counterparts to take complementary actions to maximize the impact of recent Treasury designations of PRC entities and individuals involved in the sale and production of illicit fentanyl precursors. In April, Secretary Yellen established a new Treasury People's Bank of China cooperation and exchange on anti-money laundering to enable us to better share information to address illicit financial activity in our respective financial systems. We also maintain a close partnership with Mexico, and we continue to build on Secretary Yellen's trip to Mexico, where she secured high-level political support to further enhance this partnership to bolster our collective understanding of cross-border illicit finance threats. Finally, Treasury is also working to update our domestic frameworks to make it harder for illicit actors like CMLOs to hide and evade justice. This includes implementing important provisions in the Corporate Transparency Act, as Chairman Whitehouse noted. These transparency measures, including reforms to the real estate and investment advisor sectors, will bolster our ability to protect the U.S. financial system from abuse by CMLOs and other illicit actors. I just want to close by thanking the men and women of TFI for their incredible work to combat these threats and protect our national security. I would also like to thank the caucus for its support and its collaborative work with Treasury. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Nelson. We turn now to Acting Assistant Director Mayoral.
Good afternoon, Chairman White. Good afternoon, Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chairman Grassley, and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the critical role Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, continues to play in addressing the emerging threat posed by Chinese money laundering organizations, or CMLOs. As a primary criminal investigative component of the Department of Homeland Security, HSI has a broad investigative mandate and unique customs and financial authorities which we utilize to identify, disrupt, and dismantle transnational criminal organizations through criminal investigations and prosecutions. CMLOs represent one of the most worrisome new threats in combating transnational organized crime. CMLOs are relied upon by the Mexican cartels and other transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, to launder their illicit gains. CMLOs operating in the United States act as foreign currency exchanges, enabling TCOs to exchange U.S. dollars derived from their criminal activity for foreign currencies. Often the use of encrypted apps beyond the reach of law enforcement allow TCOs and CMLOs to move vast sums of dirty money quickly and quietly. Virtually unheard of, less than a decade ago, CMLOs have come to dominate much of the money laundering globally. CMLOs use a number of complex money laundering techniques to help Chinese citizens evade China's currency controls, including the use of Chinese underground banking. The underground banking system involves paying the amount required to be remitted overseas to a local bank account controlled by the CMLO. The CMLO then arranges for a reciprocal payment or mirror transfer to be made into a bank account of the remitter's choice. CMLOs use these mirrored swaps to launder funds for TCOs faster and cheaper than other professional MLOs. The rise of Chinese underground banking activity in the United States is largely attributed to stringent currency controls imposed by the People's Republic of China on its citizens. Chinese law limits Chinese citizens from transferring more than $50,000, driving Chinese citizens seeking to circumvent currency restrictions to increasingly rely on the services of CMLOs for access to the US dollar. One of HSI's top priorities is to investigate the vast international money laundering schemes connected to the illicit narcotics trade and other cross-border criminal activities. HSI special agents work to identify and seize the illicit proceeds and instrumentalities of crime and target financial networks that transport, launder, and hide such proceeds. As a customs agency with significant access to financial and trade data, HSI is the U.S. government's primary law enforcement agency responsible for investigating trade-based criminal schemes. HSI's financial efforts in fiscal year 2023 resulted in 2,474 arrests, 1,579 criminal indictments, 842 convictions, and the seizure of $457 million in illicit currency and other assets. At the national level, HSI has established the Cross-Border Financial Crime Center, or CBFCC, a public-private partnership to strengthen the United States anti-money laundering framework. The CBFCC convenes federal law enforcement agencies, partner nation authorities, banks and financial institutions, and financial technology companies to promote collaboration on cross-border financial crimes. At the local level, the HSI El Dorado Financial Crimes Task Force, or EDTF, remain one of the most historically effective platforms to identify, mitigate, and close the gaps exploited by TCOs to disguise and move their illicitly obtained funds. Initially established in New York, the EDTF are now being rolled out into the 29 other HSI domestic offices. The EDTF bring together federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement to disrupt and dismantle the transnational money laundering organizations by prioritizing high-priority financial investigations, actively engaging private sector partners, and leveraging federal and state laws and regulations to bring successful prosecutions. Over the last decade, EDTF investigations alone led to over 2,100 arrests and the seizure of over $2.6 billion with a B in illicit proceeds. HSI partners with the U.S. Department of Treasury Financial Action Task Force, U.S. Department of Justice Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, Bank Secrecy Act Advisory Group, and the Five Eyes Law Enforcement Working Group to provide anti-money laundering assessments, training, best practices, and lessons learned in the fight against global money laundering. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Acting Assistant Director Mayoral. We now turn to Mr. Kimbell from the Drug Enforcement Administration.
Good afternoon, Chairman Whitehouse, Co-Chair Grassley, and distinguished members of this caucus. It is my honor to appear here before you today. On behalf of the Department of Justice and the approximately 10,000 employees of the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, I'm particularly thankful for the opportunity to discuss the role of Chinese money laundering in our current drug crisis. I'm grateful for the time allotted to testify and thank the caucus for bringing up this important topic. Our nation is in the midst of an unprecedented drug poisoning and overdose epidemic that has devastated countless American families and communities. This scourge has claimed the lives of 107,941 Americans in 2022 and an estimated 110,000 Americans in 2023. As a nation, almost 300 Americans a day are lost to drug-related deaths. Nearly 70% of all drug-related deaths in the United States involve illicit fentanyl. That figure does not include those who overdose and are later revived with life-saving treatments like naloxone. The two cartels responsible for controlling the majority of fentanyl trafficked in the United States are the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels. These drug trafficking organizations are highly sophisticated, extremely dangerous, and operate throughout Mexico and the United States. Notwithstanding the cartel's ruthless and greedy nature, they still rely on illicit enablers to supply precursor chemicals and money laundering services to carry out their unlawful agenda. To counter the dangerous threat of fentanyl waged by the cartels and their illicit enablers, the DEA has realigned all investigative resources to target the entire network and each step of the fentanyl supply chain. The fentanyl supply chain begins with Chinese chemical companies responsible for supplying precursor chemicals to the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels. Money launderers represent the end of the supply chain and allow the entirety of the logistical network to remain profitable and operational. In our investigations, the DEA has witnessed the evolving trend of Chinese money laundering organizations becoming the prominent criminal groups, collaborating with the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels to launder their dirty money. The relationship between Chinese money laundering organizations and Mexican cartels provide access to well-established money laundering networks operating in most metropolitan areas of the United States. These sophisticated networks are incorporated with established worldwide trade entities, including Chinese imports and exports. Chinese money laundering organizations possess a unique capacity to compartmentalize networks and recruit from within Chinese communities that have expatriated worldwide. DEA's investigations indicate Chinese money laundering operations will continue to expand due to their ability to exploit regulatory gaps and quickly change operational methodologies. Chinese money laundering organizations use a variety of methods to include the Chinese underground banking system, convertible virtual currencies, bulk shipment and storage of large amounts of currency, and the purchase of real estate and other properties to diversify and conceal their furtive activities. To combat this threat, DEA has added a strategic level to all of our investigations by creating 3 definitive counter-threat teams. One team is dedicated to the Sinaloa cartel, a second to the Jalisco cartel, and a third to illicit finance. Each of these counter-threat teams centralize intelligence and data from our 334 offices worldwide and utilize all available tools to effectively map the cartel's network and target the complex supply chains at every step. To ensure utilization of every available resource, DEA has paired our Attorney General Exempted Operations Program and our newly created counter-threat team, Illicit Finance, to maximize efforts and to ensure results. This pairing has sharpened our focus and aided in the identification of significant money laundering networks that were previously unidentified. This pairing is effectively coordinating the prosecution of money laundering networks across multiple judicial jurisdictions at this time. DEA's AGO program has demonstrated a long history of success. DEA's AGO program has seized approximately $5.6 billion in cash and assets and has made over 14,000 arrests in the United States and abroad since the year of 2000. As a citizen of this great country, we must by all means do everything possible to stop this national crisis. Success hinges on DEA's targeting and enforcement efforts pursuing the illicit production and distribution of fentanyl. DEA plays a crucial role in identifying and pursuing these criminal syndicates responsible for supplying fentanyl to our neighborhoods across the United States. The men and women of DEA are relentlessly focused on combating the deadly drug poisoning epidemic and on saving American lives. Thank you for this opportunity to appear today before this caucus, and I look forward to any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's been my experience that in our drug enforcement efforts, we focused a lot on the illicit product itself and on the distribution system for that illicit product. That's the way I operated as U.S. Attorney and Attorney General. We've had plenty of busts with the drugs and everything laid out on the table. And we focused less, I think, on the financial systems that allow the money to get back to the cartels, and we focused even less on the supply chains of legitimate chemicals that are precursors to the illicit substances. And it makes some sense, because if you're making busts, the illicit drug is itself contraband. If you've seized it, you've got a case. But money is not in and of itself contraband, and precursor chemicals are not in and of themselves contraband. You actually need to understand how the system works in order to show how that fits, and in order to make the case. So it's more complicated and it's more difficult, but that's what you need to do to make the case on the finance and supply chain sides of this industry. And I would say, moreover, that if we're really going to be effective, we have to not only know what the systems are to be able to connect dollars and precursor chemicals to cases, we have to know what the systems are so we can figure out how to disrupt and degrade them. Because in my view, there is an architecture of secrecy globally that not only cartels, but kleptocrats, international criminals, terrorists use to hide and maneuver their ill-gotten gains. So that's where I really want to focus. And I guess I appreciate very much, Undersecretary Nelson, the work that's been going on at FinCEN. We've tried to get you more resources. But give us a quick response on where you think additional resources would best be deployed in order to take on that systems disruption function.
Thank you for that question, and I think we absolutely agree. The key to preventing the ongoing abuse of our financial system is closing those gaps that I think in the work of the AMLA Act of 2020 and obviously the Corporate Transparency Act, we've identified together some of those big gaps. One, obviously having information about shell companies and those vehicles that we know that drug trafficking organizations have long used in our system. And now that we have a beneficial ownership registry set up with over 1.5 million businesses have already provided information to FinCEN about their true beneficial owner, we believe this is going to be an incredibly valuable tool for law enforcement.
And the resources needed?
You know, I think we appreciate the resources that have been granted to us to date, but reflecting that we have really surged to support the standing up the beneficial ownership registry registry itself, and all of the technical and personnel support in support of that, and it's frankly not sustainable on an ongoing basis absent additional resources.
And it probably should actually require some more resources once the regulations about enablers in residential real estate, commercial real estate, and the investment side go into operation.
Absolutely, and we think, again, we're closing the biggest gaps in our anti-money laundering, countering and financing terrorism system in the United States, and really bringing us to compliance with international AML-CFT standards. It's so critical that it's just not the United States, but United States leadership, so that we can push out the message that we need systemic change in all of our respective jurisdictions in order to fight, to your point, the ability of these bad actors to engage in this form of jurisdictional arbitrage that we see so frequently.
And similarly, it's important that we get the enablers themselves. It should not be okay for a professional who's in an investment bank or in a big real estate firm to be dodging responsibilities for money laundering that banks have to do, and basically giving aid and comfort to our enemies, correct?
Absolutely, and as you know, the administration supports your Enablers Act to help get after exactly that challenge. The thing I would just say there, again, is just a plea for additional resources, so to the extent that we have those new authorities, we'll be able to implement them to their fullest extent.
And Mr. Kimbell, a quick word on the illicit finance counter-threat team that DEA has stood up, I gather, in June. Can you tell us a little bit about the personnel and budget of that in the context of a 10,000 person or so agency?
So we have 3 counter-threat teams, a total of about 65 investigators. We stood
What are
up
the
the
three?
illicit finance.
One of them is illicit finance. What are the other two?
One focuses on the Sinaloa cartel and one focuses on Jalisco cartel.
Okay.
We created the third, the illicit finance team, because we started seeing so much crossover between the cartels when it comes to laundering money. So we've paired up with the IRS. We have CBP involved. Right now, we're expanding our operations in illicit finance. We started breaking down all of our AGO investigations. We took all of the data that we were finding, and we compiled that, and we started running that with our other partner agencies to really identify money laundering networks that we didn't know previously existed. It's been a very rewarding experience, and one of the things, the priority for this is getting prosecution across multiple judicial jurisdictions. We're seeing these money laundering networks operating together across the United States, but in the past, we haven't organized the prosecution to actually target those networks.
Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Mr. Kimbell, taking off from the video that I showed everybody, Oklahoma had given the farm a medical marijuana license. The application for the license fraudulently stated that the operation was 75% owned by Oklahoma resident as required by state law. Instead, the marijuana farm was run by an ex-convict reportedly awaiting trial for a separate shooting incident. This isn't an isolated occurrence. Oklahoma law enforcement has shut down more than 800 marijuana farms in the last 2 years for operating illegally. So my question, given history like I just stated, does the fact that a state, any state licensed marijuana farm mean that the farm isn't generating illegal proceeds?
Sir, thank you for the question. We're frequently seeing, we've identified in 23 states that Chinese organizations have taken over the cultivation of marijuana. Some of those are legitimate, some of those are illegitimate. The vast majority that we find in working with our state and local counterparts are illegitimate. That means that some of the properties are bought with third-party actors, but the people working in those facilities and cultivating those facilities are controlled and work at the behest of Chinese money laundering organizations and marijuana growers organizations. We found this is a significant problem, and it goes from the California all the way across the country into the Northeast, and it's becoming a serious challenge that we all are looking to do more to stop the problem as it's ongoing.
So a state-approved farm can generate illegal proceeds, right?
It can, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chester, at an October Drug Caucus hearing, I asked the State Department for a briefing before the U.S. lifted sanctions on China to secure fentanyl cooperation. I never got that briefing. In November, the Biden administration lifted sanctions. This month, the House China Select Committee issued a report finding the Chinese government publicly subsidizes the export of fentanyl and knockoffs. This graph that you see is one of several subsidies that they found. Given these findings, it seems irresponsible to appease China with relaxed sanctions. My staff received an email that you are at this hearing, quote, representing the White House. So this legitimate question, was the Biden administration aware of this illicit narcotic subsidy program before it made concessions to the Chinese government?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I'll answer this in a couple ways. The first one is, with the help of the intelligence community, the administration has what we consider to be a very good picture on what is and is not the role of the Chinese government in the flow of precursors and fentanyl into the United States and has for an extended period of time. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is it is critically important that we engage the government of the PRC in helping us to be able to deal with this because they are criminal elements within China or the preponderant support part of the problem. And so our engagement with the PRC is not designed to paper over or sugarcoat anything. It's designed to engage a country that can do the most to help solve this problem with our understanding of what their role is in it.
So our government was aware of the illicit narcotic subsidy program before it made concessions to the Chinese government?
Senator, please understand, in a public forum, I really would not like to get into what we do and do not know about the Chinese government. What I will say about this report, though, is that we appreciate the committee putting it out. I think it's all part of the broader discussion that we have with the PRC and a part of the picture of what the PRC's role is in this and an element of our engagement with the country overall.
Okay. Mr. Kimbell, I'm still waiting for a DEA to respond to my questions for the record from October 2023 Drug Caucus hearing. Homeland Security Investigation gave us their report on April the 19th. Can you get us a response to our request?
Yes, sir, I'll track it down and get a response.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, October is quite a long time, actually. So thank you for that, Mr. Kimbell. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to news reports, in 2021, 80% of the marijuana sold in California originated in illegal grows. Can anybody explain to me why, when states have presumably legalized some aspect of the marijuana trade, some medical marijuana, others recreational and the like, why 80% of the marijuana sold in California would be sold or originated in illegal grows? What's going on here? Mr. Kimbell?
Thank you for the question, sir. I think with any business, there's the ability to break the law with that business. By selling marijuana illegally through the black market, they're able to skirt tax laws, and they're able to do a multitude of different things by not following the regulations.
So by presumably legalizing, at least at the state level, if not at the federal level, marijuana trade, it hasn't eliminated the illegal activities of growers, distributors, and users, right?
Correct.
Let me turn your attention to remittances. According to my figures here, $63 billion of remittances were received by Mexico alone last year, mostly from the U.S., although not exclusively, which made up 4% of Mexico's gross domestic product, and which is up 7.6% over the previous year. Now, I realize that people who come to the United States and work want to send money home to their friends and families, but it seems to me that this is rife for exploitation by various bad actors for money laundering and the like. What is the current, Mr. Nelson, maybe this would be a good one for you. What's the current state of our ability to discern exactly how many of these remittances are being used for presumably benign purposes as opposed to those that are being used for illicit activity like money laundering?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator. I think I would respond in maybe just two parts. First, of course, given the volume of financial flows between Mexico and the United States, this is an area that we're paying close attention to. I would say in an open forum, we haven't assessed that we are seeing a tremendous amount of abuse by drug trafficking organizations on remittance transfers, but can provide a more detailed explanation of why that is in a
I think
different setting.
there's a $200, I believe, threshold for reporting, but certainly, as we've seen in other financial transactions, it's easy to structure some of these ways to circumvent that requirement.
Well, this goes exactly to the second point. The thing that FinCEN colleagues do, and particularly around this question of countering narcotics trafficking from Mexico, is engaging with financial institutions, bringing them in with law enforcement partners, and having a conversation about trends and typologies to look for, particularly as it relates to fentanyl flows and all of the money laundering techniques that support those flows and that trafficking, but also generally in support of financial typologies that relate to the trafficking of guns and people and of course drugs. So that is one of the key ways in which we play sort of the muscle between law enforcement and financial institutions to ensure that financial institutions know what to look for to prevent exactly that type of abuse.
So I've drafted legislation that we call Ending the Use of Remittances to Finance Terrorism, Narcotics, and Human Trafficking Act, and basically to create remittance security task forces, among other things, made up of Treasury, DOJ, DHS, local state law enforcement, and the like. I'm looking for a Democratic co-sponsor for that bill, and I think the chairman would be a good choice for that. But do you think it would be useful to create more transparency, more eyes on the target to try to create some sort of remittance security task force?
I think in principle, we are seeking more transparency. We're seeking additional opportunities to share information with our Mexican counterparts, and certainly happy to take a look at your bill.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may I follow up one more question, Mr. Kimbell?
And we'll have a second round as well.
Okay. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay, but thank you for this. This is a sensitive topic, but last 3 years, about 1.8 million people have evaded law enforcement coming across the border. The Border Patrol calls them gotaways. And we don't know whether they are criminal fugitives, whether they're drug mules, whether they're engaged in some other sort of activity, potential terrorist activity in the United States and the like. But Mr. Kimbell, do you agree with me that the fact that 1.8 million migrants who transited our border, who've evaded law enforcement, that in all likelihood would involve people involved in the illegal drug trade?
It would, our investigations show that some of those people that cross are involved in the illegal drug trade.
And we just don't really have a handle on that, I presume, since they did get away.
It's very hard to get a handle on that many people, sir.
Thank you.
And Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Chair Whitehouse and Ranking Member Grassley, for holding this hearing today. Thank you to all of our witnesses for the work that you do to stem the flow of illegal drugs and their precursor chemicals into the United States and to prevent the laundering of profits from this drug trafficking. So, Undersecretary Nelson, I want to start with a question to you and really build off of the report that Senator Grassley asked you about. Earlier this month, the House China Select Committee published this report showing that the Chinese central government provides tax rebates to producers of fentanyl analogs and precursors. Through these subsidies, the Chinese government is supporting the flow of fentanyl into the United States and other countries. Has the Treasury Department assessed whether these subsidies may be considered a form of material support for the international fentanyl trade? If so, what options would this give the Treasury Department to leverage the possibility of sanctions to stop the Chinese government from subsidizing illegal fentanyl?
No, thank you very much for that question. And you know, as colleagues have said, we obviously are looking closely at the report and the information in it. One of our overall approaches with China is in recognition that these Chinese money laundering organizations are violating Chinese law, and the Chinese are best positioned to be able to take action to prevent them from operating within China. So in that context, Secretary Yellen, who was just there earlier this month or last month, created a channels so that we can directly talk about illicit finance issues within our respective systems. And certainly that paired with the Counter Narcotics Working Group is an opportunity to encourage and press and really have the Chinese live up to the commitments that they made in those channels to look and work with us on exactly these issues. And in that context, we provided a number of specific information about entities of concern and are in an information exchange with the Chinese about those entities.
Thank you for that answer, but I just want to be clear, even if they're giving tax rebates, even if the Chinese government knows these companies are violating their law and supplying support or supplying precursors, we're not looking at whether the tax rebates themselves constitute material support?
So under OFAC's sanctions authorities, to the extent, of course, any individual or entity is providing material support, they could themselves be sanctioned.
Okay, thank you. To each of you, I traveled to China as part of a bipartisan congressional delegation last year. After we pushed President Xi, he committed to working with the United States to stop the flow of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors to the United States. And I will add here that he heard, and all of the Chinese government officials we met with heard from each and every one of us about examples of the just way the fentanyl trade has devastated our communities. Doesn't matter what part of our country, which political party you're in, this is just tearing families, communities apart. So we need to see action. The Chinese government needs to disrupt the trafficking of chemicals used to make illegal fentanyl, and it needs to disrupt the money laundering that enables drug traffickers. So what is one action that the Chinese government could take to disrupt the money laundering organizations that finance the illegal fentanyl trade? And we'll start with you, Mr. Chester, and we'll just go right down the line.
Thank you, Senator. The first thing I'll say is the delegation that you were part of was instrumental in helping the United States get commitments from President Xi and from the PRC in order to take this much more seriously and to make some tangible progress. I would say that when it comes to the money laundering, some of the engagement that Undersecretary Nelson was talking about, particularly in those areas where individuals are circumventing Chinese law as much as they are the United States, and opening up engagement on specifically on the money laundering aspects, I think holds the greatest promise in being able to deal with this issue on a bilateral level.
Thank you, Undersecretary Nelson.
I concur wholly with that.
Okay. I'm having a hard time reading this far, which means I need new glasses, but to our next witness, sorry.
Not a problem, ma'am. HSI is a law enforcement agency to specifically target Chinese money laundering organizations operating within our borders. We created a cross-border financial crime center to exchange information with our financial sector partners and foreign partners about the techniques and methods that we are uncovering during our investigations. So the banking industry, and also we have partnered with U.S. financial regulators. So we share the techniques and the methods that we have uncovered during our investigations of Chinese money laundering organizations operating within the United States with them, so they can create a more robust anti-money laundering compliant framework.
Thank you. And sir.
Thank you for the question. We would like to see more cooperation from the Chinese where they're actually sharing intelligence with us to, when they identify people in their own country that are breaking their money laundering laws, we would like to see that information pass so we can get a bigger picture of exactly the events that are transpiring.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. So we'll do a second round now before we let you all go back to work. And I want to frame the question I'm going to ask by pointing out my view that we are in a clash of civilizations, akin to the famous title of Sam Huntington's book, only that clash of civilizations is between rule of law and democracy on one side of the clash and rule of crime and autocracy on the other side of the clash. And that much of the evil that has befallen America and the world in the last 20 or 30 years emerges from that world of rule of crime and autocracy. So it really matters to go after its institutions and degrade them. We didn't just shoot the V-bombs, or Churchill didn't just shoot the V-bombs when they came over London. He went back and bombed the Ruhr Valley where the V-bombs were being made. We went after the structure. And what I look out and see is that there is a structure of financial secrecy that is available pretty much to all comers. It's not specific only to the narcotics business. It's also if you've looted your country, or if you are running trafficking organizations, or if, you know, whatever you've done to be a crook, or if you're a terrorist and don't want your money found, available to you are Chinese money laundering organizations, Cypriot bank accounts, Cayman Island corporations, Dakota trusts, and sadly, as Secretary Yellen had to acknowledge, U.S. shell corporations is an important part of that architecture. Now, the Corporate Transparency Act is going to degrade that piece of the architecture, but that architecture is still there, and it is facilitated by professional enablers who go home and act like they're normal, legitimate people, even though what their real job is to facilitate, to aid and abet our enemies on the other side of that clash of civilization. So what I'd like to see is real trade, diplomatic, economic, and other consequences for countries that support and permit that kind of activity. We've done a pretty good job at making sure that if countries allow child labor, they hear about it, and across a whole bunch of different vectors, again, economic, diplomatic, trade, and others, there are very significant penalties for them doing that. And we should have similar penalties for those who support that international architecture. So my questions, do any of you doubt that there is, in fact, a fairly robust and fairly coherent international architecture of secret finance that is available to criminals and autocrats around the world?
No, Senator, not at all. And in fact, this is the essence of commercial disruption, which is to acknowledge that architecture, find its vulnerabilities, and target them all simultaneously, with the understanding that there's material moving back and forth in terms of precursor chemicals and machines, but there is a financial underlay that lubricates that entire process. And that's in terms of the profits, but also in terms of the operating capital, because it costs money to do these things. So what commercial disruption is designed to do is to use the tools that we have in a more sophisticated fashion and bring tools to the table that we probably have not fully employed before in order to be able to go after just what you described, which is the essence of this global illicit business. And so the 21st century model that I described, earlier in my oral testimony of packaged drugs that move across the border and go through a hierarchical cartel, everyone involved in that knows that they're a criminal. It's fairly localized, and that requires a purely law enforcement approach. You find the individuals that are doing it, you eradicate the poppy fields or the coca fields, you find the labs, and you arrest the people. While that still exists, we have this global illicit business that involves financiers and wealth managers and bankers and thousands upon thousands of individuals who make this machine work that are not amenable to a purely law enforcement approach. And so we have to use other tools in a more sophisticated fashion. And so absolutely agree with your characterization, and that's why our strategic approach to this has to be much more sophisticated than simply what we had before, when the drug producing and trafficking environment was much different than what we're dealing with now.
Yeah, I think that Mr. Kimbell's agency's work to set up an illicit finance counter-threat group is a good thing. I'd like to see it 10 times the size. But that attacks it from one side. I think from the other side, you have to attack the political and professional enablers as well, so the whole system gets degraded. With that, let me turn to Senator Grassley.
In December, President Biden released the prolific money launderer Alex Saab to Venezuela as part of a deal cut with narcotic terrorists and President Nicolas Maduro. Was the DEA consulted before the Biden administration released Alexander Saab? And the case against Saab now is, of course, foreclosed because he was fully pardoned. When will you release the investigative file?
Sir, thank you for the question. Sir, we were not consoled before before he was released. I will have to check the status of the investigative file. I'm not sure exactly what the status of that file is at this point in time. Well, I can find out and get back with you.
Well, even though, please do that, but there wouldn't be any reason we wouldn't be able to see the investigative file, right? Or wrong?
If I would have to check the status. I do not know if it's open or closed at this point in time.
Okay. Mr. Nelson, after Secretary Yellen's meeting with Chinese officials in Beijing at the beginning of the month, she remarked that the U.S. and China will share best practices and information to clamp down on loopholes in our respective financial systems. What sort of information does the U.S. government plan to share with China?
So following Secretary Yellen's trip to China, where she and her counterparts had a direct series of engagements around our respective illicit finance challenges, a group met here in Washington, D.C. just a couple of weeks ago and specifically identified illicit finance moving through virtual assets as an area of particular shared concern, also looking at our respective capacity to understand transparency within our corporate formation system and our implementation of our beneficial ownership authorities. They talked about relatively specific challenges like pig butchering, which is a form of a scam in order to sort of generate funds in a relationship of trust before the scam artist steals from the victim. And then we also had an opportunity to talk about regulation of financial technology. But the idea is really to set an agenda in these regular meetings and then obviously continue to build on the prior conversations while identifying issues of shared concern moving forward. And specifically in the context of it's not just issues where we both are worried about, but to the extent that Secretary Yellen has led conversations directly about our deep concerns about China's role in facilitating the trafficking of fentanyl and other synthetic narcotics. It is a dynamic where they may have concerns that aren't our concerns, but we are expressing directly with them concerns that we perceive emanating from their system.
For you as well, did the Chinese government disclose its illicit narcotic subsidy program to any American official during discussions about enhanced cooperation?
That I don't know. I'd have to come back.
Does the Treasury Department plan to raise China's illicit narcotics subsidy program in future talks with China?
Again, don't know about that specific program, but again, we are looking closely at the report and then happy to have a follow-on conversation in a confidential or classified space.
Yeah. To Mr. Mayoral, since 2020, auditors have been calling on HSI to do more to counter money laundering. In 2020, Government Accountability Office report mentions that HSI does not have a clear guide on how best to operate its trade transparency unit, which counters trade-based money laundering. Further, the Office of Inspector General's report said that HSI does not retain expertise to combat these schemes. My last question is, what is HSI doing to improve its trade-based money laundering operations?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. Trade transparency, the trade transparency units is part of the foundation of the creation of the Cross-Border Financial Crime Center. Trade-based money laundering is probably the most used form of money laundering by transnational criminal organizations. The way that we are addressing the findings of the GAO audit are twofold. We are first automating our system, our computer system. We relied on software that was, to put it mildly, a bit clunky and require manual entries and manual searches. We have come up with a plan to make a lot of the functions automated. We have also requested budgetary enhancements to create more positions for our trade transparency unit. But in the meantime, to address the personnel staffing shortages that we currently have, we have merged our trade transparency unit with our bulk cash smuggling center to create the cross-border financial crime center. That way, we can cross-train our personnel on trade-based money laundering and customs fraud violations, which are part of the trade transparency unit findings that we have uncovered over the years. Like I said, trade is mainly is the main way in which transnational organized crimes launder their proceeds. So we have to make sure that employees are not only trained on the latest techniques, but also trained on customs fraud violations that a lot of times are the violations that uncover that trade a fraud that is being committed.
Mr. Mayoral, I'd like to jump in on a question as well, if you don't mind. We used to make cases called structuring cases, which is when somebody is taking a $200,000 deposit and breaking it up into $9,000 chunks so that no individual deposit has to be reported as a suspicious activity report. I'm hearing now that in some of this money laundering activity to bring revenues back to the cartels, deposits are actually being made in big numbers, in reportable numbers, not being structured down to under $10,000, which presumably triggers a SARS report, right? So the concern I have is whether there's been some degrading of the SARS reporting system such that people involved in the criminal enterprise of returning money to drug cartels now feel comfortable making deposits that are large enough to trigger the SARS report. People used to try to avoid that. Now it doesn't seem that that's the case so much. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question, Chairman Whitehouse. What we're seeing is not a degradation of the SART reporting mechanism. What we're seeing is, especially within the Chinese money laundering organizations, is the new methods that are being utilized by the money laundering organizations to avoid being caught smurfing, structuring those transactions to, not trigger the reporting requirements. What we are seeing is a couple of things. The two main ones is the utilization of money mules, people that get hired by the cartels. These are people that think that they're not doing anything wrong. A lot of them, laborers, cooks, that are getting hired by the cartels by the Chinese money laundering organizations to open bank accounts using fictitious, high-quality Chinese passports with fictitious identities. So by doing that, if the bank notices suspicious activity, they will file the report. The problem is that the report is being filed on a person that doesn't exist. The other method that they are utilizing is the insider threat method. We have encountered more than a few cases in where the Chinese money laundering organization has, number one, has tried to bribe bank officials at the different bank branches so they can, make them look the other way when opening bank accounts using fictitious, high-quality Chinese passports, or to verify if the bank accounts that they have opened through the money mule system that I just described are being monitored by law enforcement agencies. The other thing that they're using by placing members of the organization within the bank branches is to not only monitor the account, but to control and change the addresses once the bank accounts are open. They are changing the addresses and the phone numbers to addresses and phone numbers that they control. So they will receive the ATMs to those particular addresses and the phone numbers. So if the bank calls to check on the client, it will be a member of the organization answering the phone on the other line. So we're not seeing a degrading of the SAR system. What we're seeing is new methods to overcome the SAR regulations.
Sounds sort of like an amateur version of a reverse law enforcement covert operation in which you run a agent undercover into an organization and have to do a lot of backstopping with phone numbers that somebody answers that pretend to be the company on the resume that isn't real because they're an undercover.
As a former undercover agent, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're using our technique. Okay.
Can I
We
just
got our
make-
hands full. Yes,
Can I
please,
just make
Mr.
one plug
Nelson.
for this year? We put out a national money laundering risk assessment that outlines many of the typologies that we're seeing based on obviously great support from our law enforcement partners and totally agree with everything relayed, but still seeing, sort of bulk cash and all of the traditional forms of money laundering that we've seen for quite a while the layering in of these additional techniques, particularly as it relates, obviously, to the rise of Chinese money laundering organizations, but also the use of virtual assets to facilitate the purchase of precursor chemicals and other key inputs into the fentanyl trafficking.
Well, thank you all. Anything further? No, I'm good to go. First of all, thank you for what you're doing. We have a lot to take away from your testimony. I hope your takeaway is that on this committee, we take this question of degrading the capability of the international shadow economic system very seriously. And I don't believe that we have enough effort dedicated to that at this point. And I would be happy to hear proposals from the administration either to ramp up existing efforts or to coordinate better existing efforts or to engage in new efforts to go after that. You've heard me say how important I think this is. I think it is a clash of civilizations, and we are more or less at war with those on the other side of this crime and autocracy clash. And we've got to go after, particularly on our own rule of law side, those who are giving aid and comfort to or aiding and abetting, pick your choice of language, the enemy. So do come at us, and do know that in the Corporate Transparency Act, Senator Grassley, who is a very senior and respected Republican ranking member, and when they're in charge, chairman, Senator Graham, ditto, very senior ranking member, when in charge, chairman, Senator Crapo, ranking member, when in charge, chairman, Senator Warner, chairman of Intelligence, Senator Brown, chairman of Banking, myself, chairman here and of Budget. You've got some pretty serious people who pushed very hard to get that Corporate Transparency Act done and want to see it succeed and want to know what else needs to be done to protect our country from all of this. So don't hesitate to come back to us. And I don't know if we need to do anything in terms of, do we have questions for the record? Well, yes, we do, because Mr. Kimbell said that he would produce some things for Senator Grassley. We'd like to get that back in a week, if we could. So if you could take that back and see if you could turn around the request that he made. And with that, we'll adjourn the hearing. Thank you very much.